So we're going to look at William Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Now, before we actually get into the text, it's quite important that we understand why such a text even exists. So, Wordsworth's preface is seen as a kind of manifesto of Romanticism, especially in England. And it is in many ways a product or a reaction to the age that was before that. So the neoclassical age, for instance, emphasized on a certain kind of stiff, rigid form, for literature, where they expected that writers had to conform to a very classical style of writing. And so they believe that the better we can imitate past styles, the more likely that our literature would have value. Now, the problem with this emphasis on the past was that, one, not too many people can actually write that in that style and do justice to it. And also the fact that it can impose far too many limitations on the writer in what they can sort of produce for themselves. So there is a reason then why the neoclassical age is better known for his prose than it is for his poetry, because for a lot of people it was just like, we're not comfortable writing this way. So then when Wordsworth published Lyrical Ballads in 1798, it marks a shift in literature. It marks a shift in the literary language that is being used. All right. And so then later on in 1800, when he brings out his preface, as part of the second edition that came for the Lyrical Ballads, he is giving his reasons for why he has written in this fashion, and so he's actually starting off the entire essay with a kind of rationale, and to basically say why I had to write this kind of literature, why I felt this literature was the need of the hour, and basically to delineate the different concerns that came in his writing. Alright, so when he starts off his essay, the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, he starts off by giving us a rationale and talks about how he did not expect this kind of writing to be popular. Partly because he knew it was so different and so unfamiliar for his audience that he thought they would probably not take to it well. So more than anything, he was surprised by how many people received it well. Now, he does, of course, point out his own internal misgivings about having to justify or explain why, he wants people to read it, because he feels that if he tries to state specific reasons as to why people should be reading this kind of poetry, he would be sort of, coercing them, and he doesn't want that to be the case, because he feels it would be better if people take to it of their own accord. So then he does sort of try to offer some kind of a justification for this shift in style. And it's a marked shift because, as we mentioned, and there is this very strong emphasis on classical writing, and then you have romantic literature, which is closer to spoken speech. And so why does Wordsworth feel that's a justifiable way to write is the premise of the preface. So he does talk about, for instance, how, you have, different ages and different writers, and, everyone has their own expectations for each age. So he says, this exponent or symbol held forth by metrical language must in different eras of literature have excited very different expectations. So he's like, I understand that, people of every age have certain expectations of poetry, especially in terms of its language. But he also wonders that, for readers expecting a certain kind of archaic language or a very gaudy style, which he says when he points out, they who have been accustomed by the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many modern writers, if they persist in reading this book to its conclusion, will no doubt frequently have to struggle with feelings of strangeness and awkwardness. So he's aware of the fact that if you're expecting a certain kind of language, you are going to be disappointed with my writing. So I'm just giving you fair warning for it, And also because a lot of people will read it and then see this, very unvarnished style of writing and be like, oh, he's a very, lazy poet, very indolent kind of poet. And he's like, it's not that. I just have a very different, framework for which I want to choose for writing poetry. So he then starts to present his subject and his aims of his poetry. So he says, the principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout, as far as was possible, in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect, and further and above all to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them truly, though not ostentatiously, the primary laws of our nature, chiefly as far as regards the manners in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. So he talks about how he has chosen the ordinary because it can better express his concerns and far more simply than anyone could have imagined. So he has intentionally then chosen a certain kind of simplistic style. So his subject and aims actually becomes kind of like a discourse on language. In fact, a discourse on what is good poetic language. All right. So he then goes on to say, humble and rustic life was generally chosen. So he's consciously choosing a kind of setting for his narrative, right? And then the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in that condition, in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because in that condition of life our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity. Now, when he talks about the essential passions of the heart and elementary feelings, he is referring to philosophies that were popular around that point of time, especially those proposed by Descartes. So, for instance, the 6 primary passions, all right, in Descartes' theory was wonder, love, hate, desire, joy, and sorrow. So these were the essential passions or primitive passions. I mean, there are different ways you can probably reference them. And so these passions can be more maturely and with less restraint expressed in a rustic setting, all right, and are elementary feelings. So these elementary feelings refer to the less intense feelings, such as like, physical pain, melancholy, irritation, mental disturbances, all of which can heighten your emotions. Right? So, and the ones that will probably cause your essential passions to show up far more clearly, all of that will sort of be better expressed in this kind of a setting. So, and consequently, maybe more accurately contemplated, more forcibly communicated, because the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupation. So his idea being that this setting will give rise to the right kind of literature, and so that's why I've chosen to write in this style, one that is, an unvarnished, unadorned, real, experiential, and accessible kind of a language. Now, obviously, looking at it from a modern context, we're like, okay, this language is not accessible. But for Wordsworth's time, it is much closer to speech than what other poets used to be like. So that way, if we look at it in the context of Wordsworth's time, it is a very accurate description of colloquial language. It's just that we look at it and we're like, not very colloquial, but it is for his time. He then goes on to say, how poets ought to write more in this kind of a style, because when they choose to write in a language that's inaccessible, they are also cutting away from the lives of people, and so they're unlikely to connect with their readers. So it's a very clear criticism of neoclassicism, right? Because he's saying, being less under the influence of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. So accordingly, such a language arising out of repeated experience and regular feelings is a more permanent and a far more philosophical language. So it is, if it emerges from a more simple space, it's more real, it's more believable, it's also more philosophical. However, a lot of poets feel that by writing in a fashion that that he says separates themselves from the sympathies of men and indulge in arbitrary and capricious habits of expression, they are basically cutting themselves away from their audience, and they're not going to be able to connect. They're not going to be able to make an impact. And that kind of defeats the purpose of poetry, according to him. Because for him, poetry must have purpose. It must have a worthy purpose, right? So what he's trying to also say that, the poems that he's created are set apart from the kind of trivial writing that you are likely to find around his time period. So it's quite a strong criticism of all those who chose to write in a very lofty, inaccessible kind of a writing. All right. So he says, for all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And though this be true, poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on any variety of subjects but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. So this is a very, very important statement, and probably one of his central ideas, because he's saying that poetry may be spontaneous, but it comes from the fertile thought and imagination that can only occur from deep contemplation. So only if you're somebody who is willing to dedicate time to understanding, the experiences of the world around you, and then you sort of spontaneously let poetry emerge from that, that contemplation, only then will your poetry be true and will actually convey real life. So again, the idea that poetry must be reflective of the time and period that it's coming from is something that Wordsworth very strongly presents. All right. And not only does he say that, so not only is he talking about the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, he's also saying that there's a lot of hard work required. A lot of hard work and discipline that's required for one to be able to achieve this poetic state of mind. Because he says, by the repetition and continuance of this act, our feelings will be connected with important subjects, till at length, if we be originally possessed of much sensibility, so really an ability to see and feel deeply, such habits of mind will be produced that by obeying blindly and mechanically the impulses of those habits, we shall describe objects and utter sentiments of such a nature and in such connection with each other that the understanding of the reader must necessarily be in some degree enlightened and his affection strengthened and purified. So only if you work really hard at achieving this poetic state of mind, you'll be able to naturally sort of produce it, almost mechanically, as he said, because you will inevitably start looking at the world around you in that fashion. And then when you produce such writing, you are going to influence the people around you to feel so strongly about this world that you're creating. All right. So if we had to sort of step back and sort of give an example of what could be this, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, we can sort of tie it up with an idea that he brings up much later when he says emotions recollected in tranquility. And I think his poem Daffodils is a great example for it, because the whole premise of the poem is that he makes this imaginative, journey across a field of daffodils, and he's completely moved by what he sees. And then later on he thinks about how, sitting in my study when I'm in a pensive mood, when I think of it again, my mind is uplifted, because if I'm able to recollect that emotion and live through it all over again, then I'm able to experience a sense of joy from that moment, and also experience a kind of healing. Now, if a writer can do the same thing in their writing, because you may have an experience, you may not actually jot down your poem then, but you may contemplate on it and then recreate that experience in your poetry, so that your reader also can experience that same emotion. So in what you in tranquility have recollected will then cause a spontaneous overflow of feelings even in your reader, which is ultimately what Wordsworth feels we should be able to achieve in poetry. So he is, of course, also saying that, moving on, he does say that, it is the innate feelings that we have, that gives rise to the poem's premise, right? So, for instance, he saw a field of daffodils, he was completely amazed and moved by it, and that feeling is what gave rise to this idea that nature can be a source of healing, and I would love to impart that for the rest of the world, right? So feelings therein developed gives importance to the action and situation, and not the action and situation to the feelings. It is his desire to feel so strongly about what he has seen that makes all of this so relevant to him. So it is by associating with something that profound that takes this experience away from the ordinary and makes it profound, makes it something that is bound to have such a strong emotion or such a strong reaction on us. Much like how, say, I suppose, horror functions in the same fashion, right? Because when you meditate on something that frightening, you slowly start to build that feeling within yourself, and then you start to wonder, like, oh my god, this is making me feel certain things. So, but he feels that you should be able to do that with, like, good literature. Now, the reason why he feels one needs to read good poetry is purely because he feels that modern writing is very sensationalist. This is a very relatable kind of an understanding. So it's almost like every age always has to bemoan the popular writing of its time and be like, oh, it's so sensationalist, and look at how they constantly need so much stimulation. It seems like a very current argument as well, because he is sort of saying that, our world has a shortcoming in the fact that we are constantly in need of stimulation, and we need it from sensationalist writing. But and it's so, in fact, he says this, when I think upon this degrading thirst after outrageous stimulation, it's kind of like, it's horrid what we really want, and I'm ashamed at how naive I am in thinking that my poetry can counteract these problems that we have in society, but nevertheless I must make an attempt. So it's kind of like how every age is very critical of its popular literature. So then he goes on to the idea of style. All right, and when he goes on to the idea of style, one of the primary things he talks about is that there is no abstract language to be found in his writing, because he's making every effort to imitate the language of mankind, of humankind, and he wants to avoid this kind of convoluted writing style that does not convey true emotions. Yet he also says that my purpose was to imitate, and as far as possible, to adopt the very language of men, and assuredly such personifications do not make any natural or regular part of that language. They are indeed a figure of speech occasionally prompted by passion, and I have made use of such, but have endeavored utterly to reject them as a mechanical device of style, or as a family language which writers in meter seem to lay claim to by prescription. So basically, there may be at times certain phrases that may have come up, but since it's coming in that flow of emotion, it sounds believable. He's avoided it if it's just a cliched thought, but if he feels that it ties with this emotion he wants to convey, he's retained it, because the point is to make it as believable and realistic as possible, because I have wished to keep the reader in the company of flesh and blood. Basically, I want to keep it as real as possible, so that people should not feel that they are interacting with literature that is beyond their access in that sense. So he's also then talking about how I don't want to use a kind of language that's called this poetic diction that people say. I've tried to avoid it. I've taken much pains to avoid it. I want to be able to convey things as simply as possible. It's a lot of repetition, by the way. Because the pleasure which I have proposed to myself to impart is of a kind very different from that which is supposed by many persons to be the proper object of poetry. So pleasure is one of the purposes of poetry, all right, and it's a kind of sublime pleasure that he's talking about, but he doesn't want to use inaccessible language to achieve that. So he has, in fact, sort of extending his argument on why he's avoided this kind of language is purely because when you overuse such language, you also make it so hackneyed to the ear, it doesn't connect anymore. It just becomes too much of a cliche that it fails to make an impact on its reader. So his idea is that I don't want that to happen. I have rejected that writing. I want writing that is more real. Same thing over and over again, but he's basically very emotionally putting it all across for us. So he then goes on to talk about, and this is his another major defense that he's giving, is that a lot of people will probably look at this and be like, there's not much difference between prose and poetry in how this person is written. But his idea is that most interesting parts of the best poems will be found to be strictly the language of prose when prose is well written. And he goes on to give us an example of Thomas Gray and highlights what he feels are prose elements of Gray's poetry. And he does that because he's like, Thomas Gray is one of these people who said prose and poetry are separate, but ironically he brings them together, because he's saying that that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition, because the language of prose may yet be well adapted to poetry, all right, and that a large portion of the language of every good poem can in no respect differ from that of good prose. So his idea is that we need to come to a very different idea of literature where we don't have to make distinctions of language, like poetic language, prose language. It's just it should be good language that connects with people right across the board. And so we are coming in many ways closer to a more modern idea of language. We're also coming closer to a modern idea of free verse, because he's also like, you don't want to rhyme, you don't have to rhyme. It's really your choice, because the point is, are you conveying the meaning you want to convey? That is the main point of it. So this brings us to a close of the first part of our discussion on the preface to the Lyrical Ballads.